The Guitar Man, the untold story of Jerry Reed's grit, glory, and genius. I thought my picking would set him on fire, but nobody wanted to hire a guitar man. Long before audiences came to know him as the fast-talking sidekick in Smokey and the Bandit, Jerry Reed was already carving out a name for himself in the annals of American music. Known as the Guitar Man, Reed wasn't just another country crooner. He was a phenomenon, a lightning bolt of talent who sang, acted, and played guitar with a level of artistry that continues to inspire generations. Today, his contributions are finally getting the recognition they deserve. From foster care to the Grand Ole Opry, from factory floors to Grammy stages, Jerry Reed's journey wasn't just about music. It was about survival, perseverance, and soul. A child of the cotton mills. Born March 20th, 1937 in Atlanta, Georgia, Jerry Reed Hubbard was the second child of Robert and Cynthia Hubbard, two blue-collar workers barely scraping by in a local cotton mill. But economic hardship was just the beginning. When Jerry was only 4 months old, his parents' rocky marriage finally crumbled. With no clear custody agreement, the children were swept into a turbulent system. Foster homes, orphanages, one placement after another. Though both of his parents were alive, Jerry spent much of his childhood living like an orphan. By the age of 7, he had shuffled between more than a half-dozen homes across Georgia. It was a childhood filled with instability, but also one that forged the resilience that would later define him. And through it all, there was music. A boy with a dream, a hairbrush, and a stage made of firewood music wasn't a luxury in the Reed household. It was a lifeline. His mother, Cynthia, recognized early on that her son had a spark, a natural-born performer. So, even as she remarried and struggled to keep food on the table, she encouraged his dream. Her new husband, Hubert Howard, provided some stability. By 1944, Jerry and his sister were back at home full-time. Financial security remained elusive, but love, finally, was not. It was during these years that Jerry Reed became Jerry Reed. In the evenings, the 6-year-old would grab his mother's hairbrush and stand on a stack of stove wood in the backyard, pretending it was the Grand Ole Opry stage. He'd belt out songs from the radio, tapping his feet to imaginary applause. In a 1979 interview, Reed remembered those early days. "When I was a kid of 6 or 7, I used to get up on the stove wood pile for a stage and put on the wildest show. I'd sit beside the radio and play rhythm on a hairbrush. That was my Grand Ole Opry." For Jerry, those moments weren't just pretend. They were prophecy, from radio daydreams to Nashville nights. Despite the hardships, Reed's love for music never waned. If anything, it grew louder. His childhood wasn't marked by toys or trips, but by rhythms, melodies, and the dream of Nashville. Rockmart, Georgia, where his grandparents lived, became a second home and a vital source of inspiration. Whenever Jerry visited, he'd run barefoot through the fields with a battered guitar and tell anyone who would listen, "I'm gonna be a star one day." And he meant it. Reed didn't just want to be good, he wanted to be unforgettable. He knew early on that his ticket out of poverty wasn't school or sports. It was 6 strings and a beat that wouldn't let go. What he lacked in money, he made up for in charisma. What he didn't have in training, he made up for with feel. Jerry Reed didn't just play the guitar. He attacked it, caressed it, bent it to his will, and soon others started to notice. The legacy he left behind. Though his rise to fame took time, and though demons like addiction would haunt him throughout his life, Jerry Reed's place in music history is secure. He would go on to win 3 Grammy Awards, collaborate with legends like Chet Atkins, and appear in over a dozen films. His music blended humor with heartbreak, technique with raw emotion, and his signature finger-picking style, still studied and imitated today. But behind the showmanship was always the little boy with the hairbrush, standing on a pile of wood, dreaming big. A guitar, a nickel, and a dream. Jerry Reed's relentless rise. Jerry Reed didn't need a backup plan. While most young people are nudged toward something safe, Reed never entertained the idea. He was all in, even if that meant playing bars, truck stops, or roadside diners. The stage, any stage, was enough. From chaos to calm, the men who shaped Stevie Nicks' heart and music. When Mick Fleetwood offered Lindsey Buckingham a coveted spot in Fleetwood Mac, it came with a condition that would redefine rock history. Stevie comes too. It was audacious, a demand born of loyalty, love, and an unspoken understanding that their artistry was inseparable. That one insistence would set in motion one of the most iconic transformations in music. With Stevie and Lindsey on board, Fleetwood Mac wasn't just revitalized, it was reborn. A band once teetering on the edge of irrelevance was suddenly propelled into the stratosphere. Stevie's haunting vocals and magnetic stage presence, combined with Lindsey's masterful guitar work, created a sound that was fresh, unforgettable, and electric. And then came Rumors, not just an album, but a cultural phenomenon. It chronicled the unraveling of their love in real time, each track a sonic diary entry, raw with betrayal, longing, and resignation. As the world danced to the rhythms, Stevie and Lindsey were falling apart behind the scenes. Publicly, painfully. The success of Rumors came at a steep emotional cost. The band's internal dynamics became a tangle of passion and resentment. Arguments erupted during sessions. The pressure of fame, relentless touring, and artistic clashes eroded what had once been sacred between them. Their relationship was now less a romance than a battlefield. But from that wreckage came music that transcended pain. Stevie channeled her heartbreak into Dreams, a melancholic elegy wrapped in melody. It was a goodbye and a whisper of hope all at once. Lindsey fired back with Go Your Own Way, sharp, defiant, and laced with the bitterness of goodbye. They weren't simply writing songs. They were airing their final conversations through verses and choruses. Every lyric was a wound, every harmony a scar. The world listened and felt it. Even after the love affair ended, the bond remained. Something deeper lingered, a connection forged in youth and tempered by time, success, and sorrow. They would go on to share decades of music, standing side by side on countless stages. Each performance carried echoes of their past, glances that said everything, harmonies that reopened old memories, every note a thread in the tapestry of what they once were. Through breakups, solo careers, reconciliations, and bitter feuds, they never truly let go. Their story was never clean, never finished. It wasn't about blame or endings. It was about survival. About what remains when love burns itself out, and the ashes still glow with art. But Stevie Nicks's heart, like her voice, could never be contained by one chapter. As the chaos of Fleetwood Mac swirled around her, a different kind of relationship quietly unfolded. One far from the spotlight, yet deeply influential. In the haze of 1970s Los Angeles, amidst smoky bars and midnight jam sessions, Stevie crossed paths with J.D. Souther. He wasn't just another face in the crowd. Souther was already a respected songwriter, a vital architect of the California rock sound. His lyrics graced some of the Eagles' greatest hits. He had a presence, not flashy, but smooth, refined, and effortlessly cool. And for a fleeting moment, he and Stevie found in each other a rare, intoxicating calm. Their connection was instant. They spoke a common language, not just of music, but of depth, nuance, and artistic devotion. While her previous romances were laced with volatility and competition, Souther offered something different. He saw Stevie not as a rock goddess or tabloid headline, but as a fellow creator, a poet with a voice worth listening to. For Stevie, it was disarming. With Lindsey, love had been passion wrapped in rivalry. With Mick Fleetwood, it was complicated, a secret, impulsive entanglement. But J.D. Souther brought no storms, no backstage drama. He was steady, self-assured, a man who had already survived the whirlwind and chosen not to be swallowed by it. In that sense, he was dangerous in a way that the others weren't, because he made peace feel possible. He introduced her to a new side of the industry, one less concerned with chaos and more rooted in craftsmanship. Late-night conversations became emotional sanctuaries. Writing sessions felt more like communion than labor. There were no power plays, no battles to be won, just two artists gently orbiting one another. But not all great connections are meant to last. What J.D. and Stevie shared was brief, a gentle breeze in the middle of a hurricane. Still, it left an impression, a softness that colored her songwriting, a glimpse into a quieter life she might have lived. While it never became the grand, tormented epic like her affair with Buckingham, it didn't need to. Its impact was in its restraint, in what it didn't demand of her. And maybe that's why she never wrote a scathing ballad about him. Because sometimes, the quietest loves leave the most lasting echoes. The Lovers Who Taught Her to Walk Alone, how independence became Stevie Nicks' greatest anthem. J.D. Souther was many things. A brilliant lyricist, a West Coast icon, a man who could bottle heartbreak in 3 verses and a chorus. But perhaps most notably, he was a mirror for Stevie Nicks at a time when she was starting to see herself more clearly. He taught her restraint. Where others had chased grandeur, Souther championed subtlety. He believed a song didn't need to shout to be heard. It needed to feel. With him, Stevie learned how to strip a melody to its essence, to trust that vulnerability had its own kind of strength. But as their relationship deepened, so did a quiet tension, one not born of conflict, but of identity. Stevie had spent years fighting against the reductive roles the music world was so eager to assign her. She wasn't just the woman singing beside Lindsey Buckingham. She wasn't merely the girl in Fleetwood Mac. She was a writer, a visionary, a force. And she could feel, even in the gentleness of her time with J.D., the looming threat of being defined once again by a man's spotlight. Not because Souther diminished her, he didn't, but because the industry still did. She had seen it too often, men celebrated as geniuses, while women, even the brilliant ones, were asked who they were dating, who had written their songs, who had helped them. She refused to be a footnote in someone else's story, so she walked away. It wasn't dramatic. There was no betrayal, no teary finale. It was a soft ending, one marked by understanding, not resentment. Stevie chose herself, her future, her voice, and in doing so, she made one of the most defining decisions of her life, to step out of every shadow and stand fully in her own light. Shortly after, she launched her solo career. Belladonna, released in 1981, wasn't just a commercial triumph. It was a declaration. Songs like Edge of 17 and After the Glitter Fades carried not only the echoes of her heartbreaks, but the unmistakable tone of a woman who had taken back her power. And J.D.? He became part of that history, not as a lost love, but as a quiet influence. The lessons she learned from him about craft, about calm, about control, never left her. His presence lingered in the background, like a gentle chord that grounded her even as she soared. Their story never turned into tabloid fodder. There were no public feuds, no bitter songs aimed across airwaves, just mutual respect and the memory of something that was beautiful precisely because it wasn't meant to last. But not all of Stevie's romantic detours would be so gentle, because in the late 1970s, in the depths of Fleetwood Mac's most chaotic years, she crossed a line that would change everything. The affair that shook the band. Stevie Nicks and Mick Fleetwood had always been more than co-workers. They were survivors of the same storm, comrades in a band that seemed to live on the edge of collapse. Fleetwood Mac was a war zone of egos that made great art and terrible love. But in the aftermath of her split from Lindsey Buckingham, And in the haze of relentless touring and emotional fatigue, Stevie and Mick did the one thing they swore they wouldn't. They fell into each other. It wasn't planned. It wasn't even romantic at first. It was a collision of two fractured souls seeking refuge. Mick was married at the time. Stevie was reeling from heartbreak, still bleeding from the wounds left by Lindsay. In that context, what happened between them was less about lust and more about escape. But even fleeting affairs leave lasting marks, especially in a band like Fleetwood Mac. The moment their relationship came to light, it sent shockwaves through the group. Trust eroded. Tempers flared. The carefully managed balance of the band, already fragile, began to splinter. For Stevie, the guilt was immediate. Not because she didn't care for Mick, but because she knew what it meant. She had crossed a boundary that, in the context of Fleetwood Mac, was sacred, and yet for a time, they carried on. Their romance burned fast and bright, fueled by the same turbulence that gave rise to their music. But Stevie soon realized that the affair wasn't built to last. Not emotionally, not professionally. Mick's world was chaotic in ways she could no longer afford. She was carving out a solo identity, rebuilding herself, and that meant letting go of everything that blurred the lines. So once again, she walked away. This time, it wasn't just about heartbreak, it was about survival. In the years that followed, Stevie never denied the affair. She didn't glamorize it either. She called it what it was, a mistake. But a mistake that taught her something vital, about boundaries, about ambition, and about the kind of woman she refused to stop becoming. Because for Stevie Nicks, love was never the destination. It was the muse, the fire, the ghost in the background. Her true romance was always with the music, the one partner who never left. When fire meets fire, Stevie Nicks and Don Henley, a collision of legends. Fleetwood Mac was a band forged in brilliance and bruises, a fragile ecosystem of genius, betrayal, and unrelenting pressure. Stevie Nicks had already weathered the storm of Lindsey Buckingham and survived the complicated, combustible affair with Mick Fleetwood, and though the band held together just barely, the emotional toll had left its mark. What came next wasn't planned, but nothing in Stevie's life ever was. The moment she met Don Henley, something clicked. He wasn't just another rock star. He was Don Henley, the golden voice and razor-sharp mind behind the Eagles. He knew fame. He knew chaos. But more importantly, he knew music at the same bone-deep level Stevie did. They were equals, not in competition, not in codependency, but in capability. Their connection was immediate, electric. Intellectually and artistically, they sparked off one another with the kind of energy that could only come from two people who had already lived 1,000 lives in the spotlight. Late-night phone calls turned into all-night writing sessions. Studio dates blurred into something more personal, more intimate. This wasn't about saving each other. It was about seeing each other, clearly. For Stevie, Henley was a reprieve from the internal dysfunction of Fleetwood Mac. With him, there was no band politics, no tangled history, just two people who had built musical empires and who understood the loneliness that came with it. He didn't try to own her, didn't try to manage her. He simply met her where she was. But even the most natural connections aren't immune to reality. Theirs was a relationship that shimmered like a mirage. Beautiful, but fleeting. There were rumors. There were whispers of what could have been. And while their romance was never the tabloid firestorm that her other affairs had become, it carried a quiet intensity all its own. They shared something profound, enough so that Stevie would later reveal that one of her most iconic songs, Sarah, was partially inspired by her brief pregnancy with Don. It was a chapter she rarely spoke about, but one that clearly left an emotional imprint, a ghost of possibility, written into melody. Henley would go on to marry, so would Stevie, at least briefly. But like so many of her relationships, what she shared with Don wasn't built to last. It was a flash of something pure in a life too often overshadowed by drama. Still, the respect remained. Decades later, Henley would speak of Stevie not with bitterness, but with admiration, calling her one of the greatest talents of their generation. And she, in turn, never denied his influence on her music and her life. Because Stevie Nicks never erased her past, she immortalized it. Love as legacy, Stevie's truth in every song. What unites all these chapters, and from Buckingham to Souther to Fleetwood to Henley, is that none of them defined her. They shaped her, yes, they broke her in ways, but they never diminished her. Instead, they became the raw material she transformed into legend. In a world that often tried to box her in as the girlfriend, the muse, the voice beside the man, Stevie Nicks carved her own place. Not with scandal, not with spectacle, but with songs that captured what it meant to love and lose, to hurt and heal, to rise again. Her heartbreaks became anthems. Her mistakes, lessons written in chord progressions and laced with poetry. That's why her music endures. Because behind the mystique, behind the shawls and the tambourines, is a woman who dared to be vulnerable in front of millions, who turned personal agony into collective catharsis, who made it clear over and over again that the only person who could define Stevie Nicks was Stevie Nicks. The song that was never just a song, Sarah, Sacrifice, and the Ghosts of Love. For a brief moment in time, Don Henley and Stevie Nicks existed within the same rhythm. Two icons at the peak of their powers, bound by melody, mutual respect, and the rare ability to understand what it meant to be both admired and exhausted by fame. Their bond felt effortless, almost predestined. But as with every love Stevie had known, it came with shadows. And then, the unthinkable. She became pregnant. The news did not land softly. It struck like lightning across a relationship never built for permanence. Both were riding the crest of superstardom, their lives dictated by grueling schedules, relentless public demands, and an industry that gave very little grace to women who dared to stop, even for motherhood. Stevie was torn. She had always imagined children in some far-off version of her life, in a quieter time, with a steadier partner. But this wasn't that. Dawn wasn't ready. She wasn't either. And the world around her certainly wasn't going to wait. So, she made the most devastating choice of her life. She ended the pregnancy, not out of indifference, not out of cold calculation, but out of sheer survival. As a woman, as an artist, and as someone desperately trying to hold on to the only version of herself she had ever fought for. It was a decision that would never stop echoing. Don Henley later revealed that had the baby been born, they would have named her Sarah. That name, simple, lyrical, sacred, would become one of the most haunting entries in Stevie Nicks' discography. Sarah wasn't just a song, it was a memorial, a melody wrapped around memory, a ghost she would carry with her in every performance, every whispered lyric, for the rest of her life. Their relationship faded not with drama, but with quiet ache, the weight of unspoken grief creating distance neither one could bridge, and yet Stevie never denied what Don had meant to her. One of the great loves of my life, she called him, because he was. But in Stevie's world, love was rarely the happy ending. It was the muse, the fire, the wound, and the music was how she told the truth. Belladonna, birth of a legend, rise of a woman. When Stevie Nicks stepped into the studio to record Belladonna, she wasn't just cutting a record, she was stepping into her full power. No longer the girl in the shadows of Fleetwood Mac, no longer defined by any man, Stevie was ready to prove that she was an artist in her own right, and standing next to her was a man who saw that potential and refused to let her play small. Jimmy Iovine wasn't just a producer, he was a sonic architect, a visionary with an instinct for raw, untapped greatness. He had worked with Springsteen, Tom Petty, and Patti Smith, Artists who didn't just make music, they made moments. He knew Stevie had something timeless. She just needed the right space, and someone unafraid to challenge her. Their relationship was fiery from the start. Professionally, it was transformative. Jimmy pushed Stevie to sharpen her songwriting, to trust the weight of her words, to strip away the layers of mysticism when necessary, and let the core emotion come through. She, in turn, brought magic to the studio. Unpredictability, vulnerability, and a voice that cracked open every song. But as with so many of Stevie's creative bonds, the line between art and intimacy blurred. They became lovers. It was intense, volatile, two strong-willed forces trying to navigate love while building a masterpiece. Jimmy, ever the perfectionist, often clashed with Stevie's ethereal, instinct-driven style. But it was that very tension that made Belladonna extraordinary. It was a meeting of fire and air. Combustible, yes, but utterly magnetic. The album, released in 1981, was nothing short of a triumph. It debuted at number 1 on the Billboard 200. Tracks like Edge of 17, Stop Dragging My Heart Around, a duet with Tom Petty, and Leather and Lace, with Don Henley, became instant classics. Stevie had done what many doubted she could. She broke free from Fleetwood Mac's orbit and became a star on her own terms. But as the album soared, her relationship with Iovine crumbled. Success, once again, came with sacrifice. Jimmy reportedly struggled with Stevie's growing fame, and with her past, loves still lingering in her songs and stories. He had helped build her solo career, but he couldn't contain her. Stevie wasn't a project, she was a force. And in the end, he stepped away. Personally, if not creatively, another love lost, another song waiting to be written. But Stevie didn't look back. Not with regret, because every heartbreak had brought her closer to herself. Every man had left a mark, yes, but none had written her story. She had done that, with blood, with beauty, and with a voice that refused to fade. The one that got away, Joe Walsh, and the kind of love that doesn't fade. By the time Stevie Nicks met Joe Walsh, she had already known fame, heartbreak, and the kind of love that crashes loud and leaves even louder. She had danced through public affairs, creative entanglements, and brief, brilliant combustions. But Joe was different. This wasn't a love story built on spectacle. It was built on something quieter, something truer. They met in the early 1980s, both icons in their own right, both bruised by fame, both running on empty but still chasing meaning in the noise. He was the soulful, haunted guitarist of the Eagles. She was the reigning high priestess of rock and roll, and together for a time, they found shelter. Their love was not the tempestuous kind that defined Stevie's past. There were no screaming matches or tangled rivalries. Instead, it was steady, strangely still. Two people who had seen the worst of the world and still believed, against all odds, in something sacred. "We were a perfect couple," Stevie once said, "but the timing was wrong, and the drugs were wrong. Because even the deepest love can falter in the face of addiction." They were both struggling. The endless touring, the after-parties, the white lines that promised energy and escape. It was all catching up with them. And though they loved each other fiercely, they couldn't save each other from the darkness they had invited in. Stevie saw what was coming. She had watched others spiral, had spiraled herself. And she knew that if she didn't make a choice, if she didn't walk away, the story wouldn't end with heartbreak. It would end with tragedy. So she left. Not out of anger, not out of fear, but out of love. Because sometimes love means leaving, even when it's the last thing you want. It was, she would later say, the hardest decision of her life. Years went by, but Stevie Nicks never stopped loving Joe Walsh. Even decades later, his name softened her voice. "Has anyone ever written anything for you?" Wasn't just a song. It was her quiet tribute to him, filled with longing and loss. Publicly, she wore the persona of a rock icon. Privately, Jo remained her ghost, the love she let go because she had to. He was the great love of my life, she said, the one she didn't fight but never stopped missing. Sometimes love doesn't conquer all, and yet his presence echoed through her music, in every haunting lyric she ever wrote. By the 1990s, Stevie had survived it all: fame, addiction, heartbreak. She rejoined Fleetwood Mac, built a solo legacy, and mentored a new generation of women in music. Twice inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, she became more than a legend. She became a symbol of resilience. Her past lovers became songs, not scars. She was never just someone's muse. She was the storyteller, the force of nature, and perhaps her greatest triumph wasn't love itself, but her ability to survive it and sing through the pain.